The conventional narrative of the African novel's development begins around the time that colonialism ends, usually dating from the late 1950s. It is often structured around a tension between cultural diffusion and cultural consolidation, which is to say between hybridistic or cosmopolitan and more nativist or nationalist ways of defining the form's response to British imperial rule. The nuances and blind spots of these broad strokes positions, not mine, have been dissected ad nauseum, and it's not my intention to take a side again in this chapter. I begin here, rather, to establish a baseline for how an African novelistic genealogy, whose terms derive from the independence era, circumscribes even critical debate, entrenching truisms that do not hold up in broader historical framings. This familiar opposition of multiplicity and resistance, which has its oft-cited academic corollary in postcolonial theory versus more hardline or Afrocentric schools of thought, in fact foregrounds a common critical practice that sees individual subjects in fiction as stand-ins for a social situation. The individual is instrumentalized by the African novel, not instrumental of some analytic function within it. At its best, the tendency to read African characters as social microcosms has provided a useful foil to Eurocentric literary standards, often limitedly rooted in psychological depth to demonstrate character development. At its worst, however, it has led to a bias toward seeing African writing as transparently sociological, rather than as depicting a complex negotiation between shaping and being shaped by the world.
You're listening to Conversations in Atlantic Theory, a podcast dedicated to books and ideas generated from and about the Atlantic world. In collaboration with the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, these conversations explore the cultural, political, and philosophical traditions of the Atlantic world, ranging from European critical theory to the Black Atlantic to sites of indigenous resistance and self-articulation, as well as the complex geography of thinking between traditions, inside traditions, and from positions of insurgency, critique, and counter-narrative. Today's conversation is with Jeanne-Marie Jackson, a literary critic and scholar of world literature who teaches in the Department of English at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. She has published extensively on African literature, philosophy, and politics in both scholarly and popular venues. Her first book, South African Literature's Russian Soul, Narrative Forms of Global Isolation, is a compelling comparative study, creating intellectual space within which it is possible to connect the motifs and imperatives of 19th century Russian realist literature to the literature of South Africa in the apartheid era and the postcolonial moment. Her new book, which we'll be discussing today, was published in early 2021 with Princeton University Press and is titled The African Novel of Ideas, Philosophy and Individualism in the Age of Global Writing. Jeanne-Marie, hello.
Hi,
How are
nice
you?
to see you, or hear you, I guess.
Yes. Well, I really appreciate you making time to talk to me today about your new book. I think it's a really fantastic book. I actually really loved reading it, and it's outside of my own personal specialties as a scholar, but it's really one of these books that I think is readable from multiple perspectives, from philosophers, cultural theorists, Africanists, but also diasporic thinkers. And I really appreciate that. I learned a lot. And for me, that's a mark of a really great book, is its capacity to really teach as well as advance scholarship. So
Thank you for saying that. I think one of the things that I wanted to do with the book was to have it be readable by Africanists, kind of the most hardcore people working in a more area studies vein, or in my case, tends to be intellectual historians oftentimes. People I see at the African Studies Association or the African Literature Association, but then also have it be something that I could find real common ground through with comparatist friends and more general sort of post-colonial philosophers and historians. And needless to say, that is not an easy thing to do, and one always wonders whether they've gotten the balance quite right. So if it worked to any degree with you, then I feel extremely gratified.
Well, it really did. I myself, my PhD is, and my sensibility as a thinker and writer is in philosophy. So, I was really drawn by the book precisely because, or specifically because of its invocation of philosophy across the book. And so, one of the first question I want to ask you, which is in some ways a kind of autobiographical or personal narrative question, is why African literature and philosophy? What drew you to these texts, right? The particular literary works that you're concerned with, but also why the frame of philosophy? What is it about framing these particular works of African literature in terms of philosophy? What motivated you to that? And ultimately, what do you think it draws out of those texts that we wouldn't otherwise see?
Yeah, a lot of great interlinked questions. First, on the most basic level, I was trained in a comparative literature department. That's where I did my doctorate, which people used to joke with us was philosophy light. Not the philosophers in graduate school, they didn't even know that we existed for the most part, but people from other humanities departments. At the same time, as we were reading a lot of it, and it was a big part of my qualifying exams, it was mainly what philosophers would, shorthand as continental stuff. So I qualified in hermeneutic phenomenology, for example.
Okay.
And then very, very slowly, after I had started my current job, started reading around in what would typically be grouped as more analytic sorts of philosophical texts. African philosophy is particularly interesting when you think about that really, really broad strokes division. And I realize it's not a division that often holds up, especially when you're talking about philosophers working in what we might call a postcolonial or a decolonial vein. But the big stars of African philosophy are analytically trained, right? So someone like Kwame Anthony Appiah is the most famous example. Kwesi Wiredu, who we recently lost, was Gilbert Ryle's student. When you move into someone like Emmanuel Chukwudi, he's working really from kind of a phenomenological tradition that is bridging analytic and continental styles of thought or styles of writing. And so I ended up getting more deeply into the weeds of professional or academic philosophy than I had been exposed to or invited to do as a comparatist, especially working in a comparative literature department. I'm now in English, just by the happenstance of the job market.
Sure.
And more, I started to feel like the conversations among and between African philosophers. So for me, the Legon School, Uridu, also someone like Kwame Jeche, Eze, Appiah were the primary examples. We're having the conversations that I wished we were having in African literature and in African literary studies. And yet there was virtually no work that put the two into conversation, again, in that kind of fine-grained analytic way, right? Or people who were trained as academic philosophers, as opposed to thinking more within the broader terrain of African thought traditions, say. And that's not a pejorative understanding of what that would mean at all. It just seemed to me a big gap in the literature in the African humanities, broadly construed. And so I set out to figure out what the most obvious bridges were between the two branches of the academic humanities, African literary studies and African philosophy, people who might have jobs as African philosophers, right? Jobs in philosophy departments. And I increasingly thought, okay, what we're missing here is some sense of clarity and a premium on argument not being coded as bad in some way, not being coded as Occidentalist, as sort of liberal, capital L, in ways that have very clear colonial valences. All the things that I think working within post-colonial or decolonial thought or critical theory tend to happen, right? You get a lot of straw men, a lot of boogeymen that simply don't hold up when you go to Legon in the 1970s and 1980s, when you go to sort of early work by Appiah, so long before something like In My Father's House. And I then wanted to see African literature as in some sense, not just a conversational partner with African philosophy and all of these really influential at the time disciplinary debates that they had undergone, but as a kind of redemptive space for African philosophy that had not, I think, been as widely received by other humanists as it should have been at the time. The number of African literature scholars, or let's get even bigger, critical theory scholars who have ever read Emmanuel Eze is vanishingly small, and that's
Yeah,
a real shame. So
absolutely.
I got some juice behind it from that angle, you might say.
Yeah, and it's interesting hearing you talk about it that way because one of the things I think as a philosopher and critical theorist in a more of a diasporic context, but it also overlaps so much with what you're saying, which is this kind of approach. And one of the things I would love to see philosophers get from the book, right? If people philosophers can get eyes on your book, is the way it makes a really compelling and convincing argument for an expansion of the philosophical archive. That rather than thinking of philosophy as something that's in a kind of style, rhetorical structure of a text, which I think is very much the Anglo-American approach to what philosophy is.
Mhm.
Ironically, that's a literary distinction,
Mhm,
right? Not a
mhm.
philosophical distinction.
Yeah.
But I think you retrieve this sense in which it really deeply, in which African literature, the literary pieces you're talking about, function philosophically. That, as you say, it's not just a conversation between philosophy here, literature on the other side, but the way in which this sort of event of African thought is literary and philosophical, not even at the same time, because they don't have to happen simultaneously. It's like they are embedded in one another in important ways. I think this is a diasporic lesson, but it is especially needed in thinking about African thought as a history of ideas.
You know that's absolutely right, and I mean I think so. In my we'll talk about this later, but in my next book and what I'm working on right now, I'm moving much more into an intellectual historical domain, and that in many ways was a very natural progression. I think within the history of the African humanities. So but what the novel does that I think the best of African philosophy did, which isn't to say that African philosophy isn't still happening. I have friends who are employed as, in philosophy departments, especially on the continent, who are working in it. But I think it's fair to say that its most formative era has passed. We're losing a lot of the kind of golden age figures. Obviously, Rader's death makes that abundantly clear, and I suspect we'll see some more public writing on that in the next few weeks,
Mm-hmm,
which is great.
mm-hmm,
But what African philosophy and the novels that I'm working with both do exceptionally well is enforce a separability of elements. And by that I mean that they are not doing what I think of in my private time as the kind of phenomenological blur approach to capturing experience, right? A lot of the most prominent African novels in the past, I don't know, decade or so maybe, have been richly poetic, have been about trying to capture the guts of what it feels like to move through the world. I think of something like The Dragonfly Sea by Yvonne Adjambo-Awor, and that's not what I'm working with, which again
mm-hmm.
isn't to cast a negative light on more poetic texts that are working in a more continental vein, you might say. To say that one thing the novel can do really well, that someone like Kwesi Redu or Appiah does really, really well, is to say, hey, here's a chance to deliberately break down ideas into their constituent
Mm-hmm.
parts, to almost deliberately, naively adopt a greater separability or discreteness of elements of experience and of thought than might be available to us in living, or in writing in a way that's meant to capture a sense of living, and to work with those uh, to get to their natural conclusions. So the idea that abstraction can be part of a novel in an extremely delineated, actually spatial way. There's a lot of work on this way back in the day in Russian literature, where ideas take up actual room on a page in a novel of ideas, right? They are
Yeah.
not only embedded in our experience of interacting with each other and going through life, we have this luxury of drawing them out, of laying them out in ways that we can't get at when we are just kind of involved in conversations in the day to day. And that there is a real value to doing that, to kind of slowing down and taking that space. And so someone like Tendai Huchu, who is a Zimbabwean novelist who starts off my introductory chapter of the African Novel of Ideas, will have philosophy circles where he's on purpose, setting them outside of the hustle and bustle of a Harare street. Not because it's not important to represent what it means to be in the hustle and bustle of present-day Harare, but because he wants to do something different. And they sit in a circle and they start talking about Boethius, in his case, often comes up and saying, okay, let's have this term, and this term, right? A, B, and C in play. Let's braid them together in a way that can get us to some conclusion that we only then bring into a more applied domain. And it's done in such a marked way, right? And I think that is something that philosophy does that is distinct from what, again, to use a really broad term, theory more often does, where it's trying to reckon with the full braiding of elements as it's already happening. Philosophy is breaking them down. And so that's what I wanted to capture, moving between the two forms, right? I mean, the comparative African philosophical essay and the explicitly African philosophical novel. Hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, no, that's completely fascinating. I think it's a really instructive way of making a theory as it appears in sort of comparative literature programs and philosophy as sort of more rigidly practiced. And I don't mean rigid in a pejorative sense. I think rigid is actually a really important thing for certain kinds of disciplinary approaches. So I think that's really helpful. I do have to say, when you said, use that phrase, philosophy light, as a philosophy PhD student, European philosophy program, we may have said that about comp lit people. Ironically, now my secondary appointment is in comparative lit, so I'm back to philosophy light, I guess.
Yeah, I think I have a couple of close friends and sort of frequent interlocutors who are really hardcore analytic philosophers. I mean, Femi Taiwo and Liam Kofi Brett, and in some ways they have been my North Star for writing and presenting this book. I also wanted the book to be intelligible to them. Not that it would match what they were doing, right? I just don't have that kind of training. I'm not trained in analytic phil. But to at least be able to find some common ground.
Yeah, you mean the younger Femi Taiwo, or the older? There is the
of course, the older Olufemi Taiwo, who's also been a big influence on my own work, especially his sort of seminal work on Hegel and how do we get past just saying, well, Hegel was wrong, Hegel was racist, which of course, and what does that actually mean for what we then need to fill in the field of African philosophy, if it's not to be a mainly critical or negational project, if you will. And that was also something that I felt really strongly about in terms of the particular philosophers that I wanted my book to be working with and drawing on. So again, Oredu and Eze were, it was momentous for me when I found them and just realized how much more I had to bring to the table, how much more A game I had to bring then, and no call outs here. I don't like to do that kind of thing, but work in postcolonial or these days decolonial literary studies that will spend a single paragraph on liberalism. We know, okay, it's bad, it did bad things, and there it is, kind of footnote Habermas. And it's like, no, Oredu is not going to let you off that hook. You are going to break down, well, what do you actually mean by that? When you say democracy or a sort of democratic norm, do you mean a consensual, right, kind of consensus-based democracy, or do you mean a majoritarian democracy?
Sure.
And just parsing significantly finer distinctions, in language as clear as possible to move across disciplines was this challenge that I saw novelists, African novelists, rising to. And yet not literary criticism and not literary scholarship. So there seemed to be this real gap between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think, my original question, part of it was, how does philosophy what is the point of framing literary works with philosophy? That's a really fantastic way of thinking about that. It's able to draw out this struggle that the novels themselves are having, that if we read them in these sort of different frames or different registers, sort of escape.
Well,
You know,
and they're about gradation. That's the word that I kept coming back to too when I was editing the book and trying to fine tune on the paragraph to paragraph level is okay, when do generalizations feel earned and when do they not feel earned?
yeah.
And philosophers trained in philosophy pushed me, at least, and certainly the novelists that I'm often talking to. I'm in very frequent conversation in real life with a number of the novelists who are covered in the book, Tendai Huju, Imran Kuvadia, for example, just because we're interested in these same sorts
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
questions. And it's one thing to talk in terms of totality and the individual and the collective. And it's another thing to talk in terms of, okay, Jeche, for example, how do we define a limited communitarianism, which is one of his big terms? Where precisely does a communitarian ethic need to give way to something else? Where do analyzes Akan talking drums, for example? Where precisely do we see the
Yeah.
individual drummer as needing to take over from the codes that he's been taught? And you can't settle for the general term. You then
Hmm.
have to break it down into, okay, where is the point at which one term gives way to the next, so that we can
Yeah.
then plot or choreograph their interaction in a way that makes formal sense.
Yeah.
And again, if you cut your teeth, as I did, on reading, critics who are still hugely important to me, and reading Lukács or something, or in Russian literature, used to read a lot of Bakhtin, obviously, and so did everyone else for a while. Though Bakhtin seems to have faded over the past few years. I almost you end up working with a lot of major concepts, terms that are already aggregative of so much, and not necessarily being forced by your critical archive to do the work of figuring out what its constituent parts are.
Yeah.
And a novelist can't do that, right? Or at least a certain kind of novelist. The novelist that I was working with in this book, who is interested in this breakdown of where are we doing philosophy, where is philosophy subsumed into something else. It's just working with, a much broader range of gradations of your
Yeah.
terms. I realize I'm now getting a bit abstract, and so I'll stop, but I think you probably
No,
know what I mean.
absolutely. No, it's really interesting. And, that you mentioned Russian literature, and so I want to, this is again a sort of personal narrative or autobiographical moment, but also, as these always are for us as writers, also theoretical questions and curiosity questions. So I really liked your first book, South Africa, African Literature's Russian Soul.
Thank you.
I picked it up because I was like, I didn't know Russians were, but then I read it, and it's a really, I think, remarkable bit of comparative work. I think if people are wondering, how can we do productive comparative work, that's an excellent book to point to, because it's very difficult to do, and to do respectful of, South African literature and Russian literary sensibilities and practices. I mean, it's to be faithful to both of those and also do that comparative work in a creative way. I think it's a fantastic book. One of the things that was interesting then about reading this new book was the shift. While there are comparative dimensions to it for sure, it is in some ways much more direct, much more directly attentive to particular African literary pieces,
Mhm.
rather than a sort of transnational comparative framework, of course. But its comparative dimensions are, as you've been talking about, in some ways a sort of, that moving back and forth between philosophy and literature. But even that, as you were saying, comes from attending to the philosophical dimensions of the literary pieces themselves. But my question really is just what motivated this shift? What in what ways do you understand the books to be different in terms of method and orientation, but also in what ways are the methods and approaches similar across the two?
Mm. Yeah, it's something that I thought about a lot of a few years ago, and now I feel like I've lost my own plot in some ways. So it's really great to be brought back around to thinking about that transition, especially as I move towards writing the next book and have to redo some of those self examinations. My first book, South African Literature's Russian Soul, was in every way a labor of love. I think, as really comparatist projects often are, because you are going so small and so big at the same time. I mean, it was a revised dissertation, as first books typically, or at least often are. And so I had to be accountable, I think, for the better to experts in a couple different fields that would not at any point have really been in conversation with each other. So South African literature, not Africanist necessarily, but really, full, deep South Africanist working across
Yeah.
multiple South African languages. I was working in English and Afrikaans. I did study Xhosa and had every intention of getting into the book, and I just didn't feel that my language skills ended up at a place where I could do that and sleep well at night. And
Yeah.
then, Russianists who are, the field is changing now, but when I was trained, it was a pretty conservative field. And so to then tell a Russianist advisor, not mine, Katerina Clark, fortunately, she's a pretty bold woman in all kinds of ways. But a lot of people were like, "You're crazy, like you're nuts." I mean, who writes a book about Russians and Afrikaners?
Yeah.
Um, and I just felt that I had to go so deep into each side of that comparative equation, if you will, that then the project becomes about building your apparatus along with your reader. And I think that's what comparative literature at its best makes us do, is you have
Yeah.
to walk your reader through every step of why in the hell you have taken on this, kind of black box sort of project that you've taken on. And so it means that it is both of minute significance. I stopped because it made me anxious, but for a while I got, Google notifications when that book was cited. And I would see people doing really in-depth work and Afrikaans scholarship citing it and Russian scholarship citing it. And then you get the kind of people who are also interested in building that apparatus, as I've called it, right? That kind of negotiating device, but they don't often, as mine was, and end up being books that kind of hit the main line of the literary studies discipline as such, because people aren't necessarily going to pick up a book about Afrikaans or even South Africa, or about Russian without that more explicitly global dimension, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
So then moving towards the African novel of ideas, I thought, okay, I want this book to be something that can speak to, all sorts of people, not just scholars, but intellectuals of various shades and stripes, working in literature writ large, and people with more specific interests in each of these constituent African traditions. So moving mainly between Western and Southern Africa, which I have more specialized knowledge of, and then there's a long chapter on three Eastern African writers, where I'm comfortable, but probably have less expertise. And then speak to literature and philosophy. So I feel like I was painting on a broader canvas in that sense, even as the second book is quote unquote narrowed to be Africanist in a more obvious way. I feel like being a comparatist, and I mean that both in terms of moving across different language traditions, different intellectual traditions, but also in terms of moving across different fields and subfields, it's just a matter of always being aware of your aperture. And so you're just constantly widening and narrowing and then widening it out a little bit more and narrowing a tiny bit more. And you're doing that, but by the chapter, not just by the
Yeah.
book, to figure out exactly what that sweet spot is. And so in both books, I'm doing that, but I'm doing that in different ways.
And there really it needs to be a specific qualifier or adjective around to describe the anxiety of that widening
Oh my
in
God.
a
Yeah.
comparativist context.
Yeah.
It's it's not a small step. I mean, it's like that's where all the risk is, but that's also where all the reward is, and that's where I do think that the your first book really is great because of that. I think those widening moments are so productive and have a lot of integrity. And I'm really curious to see how the reception of your book among specialists in an African continent literature, how they see that dimension of the comparativists, the Southern, the Western, the Eastern African.
Yeah, no,
Um,
it's an important point, and it's something that I'm thinking about a lot right now because I'm writing a book right now, ostensibly on a single figure, and of course, it's never just on a single figure. You're always trying to make it do more and other. But the trade-offs between depth and breadth for this book were now not just about moving between different traditions or locations, but between different kind of dominant practitioners of different fields. So if you start writing about Kwesi Ewedu, as I do quite a lot in the first full chapter of my book, although he also appears a few times in the introductory chapter, you could easily be in conversation only with a hardcore Ewedu specialist who, so Barry
mhm.
Hallen or someone like that, who's written a book on Ewedu that's revising an earlier book on Ewedu, and you're
Yeah,
never going to go quite that deep in a
yeah,
different, in the kind of project that I'm doing. At the same time, I want him to be able to get a foothold in it. So,
yeah.
okay, how do you figure out where that place is? In a chapter where I'm writing about contemporary Southern African fiction. So Tendai Huchu in the Zimbabwean diaspora, Imran Kuvadia, who's still very much located in South Africa, in Cape Town, Masanda Nshanga, who's moving between, a kind of intra-regional focuses in South Africa.
Hmm.
So he's very much an Eastern Cape novelist in some ways. You could
Yeah.
find specialists doing incredible work in each of those respective traditions.
Hmm.
And so, again, on the chapter level, on the sub-chapter level, each of your individual chapter sections, you're trying to say, okay, who are my audiences here, right? Who are my ideal readerships? And what do I do to bring
Hmm.
them onto something like a same page?
Yeah.
And it's incredibly anxiety inducing, angsty even. I tell graduate
Sure.
students who are really working in a comparative vein that this is going to be the story of their career. So just to get used to it, you're never going to know if you've done the best that you can on that depth breadth trade off, I think.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
again, that's something that I think comparative literature in particular and philosophy also have in common, because you do have an eye to the universal, if you will, which is something different than the global, and that's a whole different
Hmm. Hmm.
conversation, at the same time as you are always going to be um, inviting criticism from people who are single writer specialists,
Yeah.
or single philosopher specialists, right?
Absolutely. And I really, with my own students, but also as a professional, talk about. I think it's so much more important to be interesting than to be right.
Yeah, yeah,
And
I hope so.
um, that's a self-serving characterization. That's someone who cares myself so much about comparative study because all the stuff you're talking about, that those are risks, but they're risks in the name of interesting insights that then for microscopic or hyper specialists or single focus specialists will risk always being wrong. But that relationship between being right and being interesting, I think, is interesting.
Well,
So
and
you,
you can't tick every box kind of thing. That's absolutely the case, I think, for both of the kind of work that we do. But at its best, what it means to me is being able to um, generate some terms for people to know that they're in shared conversations, who might not actually have had those terms before. So when an African novelist who is invested in philosophy in an explicit way, again,
mhm,
you can get into the weeds very quickly with what counts as philosophy and all of that, and I do address that somewhat in the book, but I think that conversation gets away from itself.
yeah,
Um, someone who's saying, okay, we're going to have a scene or a chapter where I'm deliberately cordoning off philosophical practice in a way that, yes, I know isn't reflective of how people are in the world. We can't cordon off what's an idea from what's an embodiment. No, but we can do it as an experiment on a page.
yeah,
That is kind of the same analytic operation as someone like Kwame Epie, who is saying, okay, I'm going to take this particular definition of personhood, or of a soul, or a will from the Akan intellectual tradition. So he has an
Mhm.
essay on something in Akan thought called the Sun Sum, which is, I think will is probably the best translation, that I absolutely love. And I'm going to cordon it off from lived experience in a way that, again, I know isn't reflective of how we live, but serves some really useful analytic purpose.
Mhm.
So Kwame Appiah, kind of early comparatist, kind of almost pre-public intellectual Kwame Appiah,
Mhm.
is doing something that should be extremely resonant to the contemporary African novelists that I'm dealing with.
Yeah.
And yet they may not be reading each other. And so I can have, I think, kind of a humble, in some ways, purpose of saying, hey, let me show you what you're both doing that you're
Yeah.
not quite aware that you're both doing. And if I can do that, then I'll feel like I've done something worthwhile with the book.
Great. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if the title, part of the title, and African Novel of Ideas, um, what I like about what you've said so far is how the depth you're giving to that phrase ideas, or that term ideas, and that phrase novel of ideas. But I want to talk about the subtitle, or ask you about the subtitle. My favorite part of the subtitle is this phrase, the age of global writing. It's a super suggestive phrase. And so I'm curious to hear what you mean by it. And, why you think it's important for us to think about global writing, um, and how that notion of global writing frames or forms your reading of the novels. And I'm thinking about it because, and this is, of course, everybody reads from their own intellectual position, as sort of hermeneutics 101. But that sense of global writing did resonate for me as something akin to what Glissant calls tout monde, right? Which is a thought that's engaged with the entire world,
Mm-hmm.
but also has the intimacy of social and cultural forms of life that aren't, generalizable, universal, right? So there's a sense of the global that's um, not evoking this sense of comparativist that's all about creative risk taking, but instead a different kind of intensification of that, where you're not outside the globe, but it's also not the globe as a sort of space of radical difference that has to be creatively put into contact. So it's really just a question: how do you think about the age of global writing and how it functions in the book? It's in the subtitle, so clearly
Yes,
it's the
yes,
frame of the book.
and the subtitle, for what it's worth, was initially Intellection in the Age of Global Writing, but as anyone listening to this who has published a book will know, no publisher is going to let you get away with having a word like intellection in your book title. So,
See, I would have loved that, but yeah, no, that's never, the publisher's never going to go
yeah,
for that.
no, we need some keywords, baby. So globality to me is a foregone conclusion, and I don't mean that in an obviously positive or negative way. It's neither an endorsement, nor a critique. It just is, right? Globalization is a done deal.
Yeah.
In an economic sense, globalization is a done deal. I think, arguably, in terms of the constitution of something like a religious identity on the African continent, which I'm working a lot with in my current project. We know things are syncretic. There's no going
Mhm.
back on this.
Yeah.
And we know we exist in an age of self-conscious networks. So not that networks haven't been there for a very long time, and I'm not going to kind of get into all the debates about when we can talk about globalization happening. Is it 1492? Is it before? Is it after? Is it the Enlightenment? People have
Sure.
much stronger dogs in that fight than I do. But whenever you date it, or to whenever you date it, no one's arguing, I think, at this point that we don't live in some kind of globalized world,
Yeah.
right? But it's not always the most meaningful facet of people's lives, and it's certainly not always the most meaningful facet of anyone's intellectual practice. And so you can't jump right to the big picture, right? I mean, the map with all of the points, discrete points filled in, and make any sense of it without figuring out where you want to go hard and, kind of go deep in the tiny, tiny, tiny portions of a map that require an intense zoom.
Yeah.
or different focalization. And that certainly is part of what, when I teach this on to undergraduates, for example, we talk about zoom lenses and what is the right setting for them. One
Hmm.
example that I use with them for Tumond actually has been thinking about those maps on flights, where you see a flight map start off
Yeah.
with point A and point B, and then the routes get filled in, and then the entire thing gets dark. And so you actually just see this kind of almost solid seeming mass.
Yeah.
And where do we figure out how to disaggregate, and giving them an actual visual to work with that, which has
Interesting.
been,
Yeah.
it's been helpful in like an intro to literary studies kind of class. But I just don't find globality particularly interesting, to be totally frank. I find people who are aware of it and trying to do something else more interesting on the whole. People who say, yeah, I know, everything is awash in movement and flux at all times. But actually, when I have my most generative moments, right, for thinking and for interacting with other people, we have to kind of bracket that out of the picture, and figure out how to think otherwise. That's what I wanted to do with this book, and to some degree, even with the first book, and then let the connections kind of generate themselves. So, what I wanted to do with the subtitle is say, okay, in the age of global writing, as in an age in which there is no such thing by some definition as a non global novel,
Yeah.
personally, I'd favor a more specific kind of generic identification of what that means. But we live in the world system. Arguably, everything that seems not global is in interaction with and or even being generated by things that more evidently are. I just don't have a lot to say about it, right? and
Yeah.
the texts that I'm drawn to don't have a lot to say about it. They
And
do have a lot to say about sitting in stillness with one's thoughts and trying to unpack them into some kind of usable form, but that presupposes the possibility of non-instrumentalism or abstraction before you get to that usability. And that's
yeah.
where I wanted to remain.
And this is, I mean, there are, big intellectual and sort of history of ideas, things at stake in this. I
Yeah,
mean, I'm
yeah,
thinking particularly about, somebody like Fanon, who is a Caribbean writer, but also his, I think in some ways, the great inheritor in Africa of Fanon's thought, Achille Mbembe,
yeah, yeah.
interested in, for all the concerns about the local and the continental meaning continental Africa, for all the continental concerns, is also reckoning with this question of humanism, right? A humanism after colonialism, after European hegemony, and so forth. But that's running alongside something like Ngugi's notion of decolonizing the mind, which, in both that book by that title, but also his literary practices in the sort of second half or even more of his career has been, is in his literary practice, is concerned with the local and the vernacular rather than the general and the universal, even if that general and universal in the case of Mbembe or Fanon is something to come, right? It's a post-revolutionary accomplishment. But that tension between an aspiration or a conversation about the universal and an intensification of the vernacular, that tension to me is really interesting and productive.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in some ways, I just ask you where you see your own work in relation to that, and maybe not just your own work in relation to that, but the novels that you're talking about. Where do they stand in terms of that, sort of post 1960 debate in sub-Saharan Africa about post-colonial identity and post-colonial cultural production? Because you're not talking about mid-century novels. That's not your focus. It's not in this sort of transitional period. And so how do these novels, are they a sort of new horizon of African literature? It gets outside that, or is it situated in that, I don't even want to call it a tension, but that conversation about the sort of future universal and the hyper localization of vernacular cultural production and identity?
Yeah. So if I can be a little bit schematic to start off this answer, and I'm sure I'll be dinged for it, but I'm going to do it anyway because time is not infinite, right? I would, if I had to, if pressed, divide African literature, you know, extremely broadly speaking, into three big eras or moments. The The first is what I'm working on now in my third book on J.E. Casely Hayford and the afterlives of something called the Fanti Confederation on the Gold Coast, is the creation of vernacular as a facet of an explicitly literary or intellectual culture. Of course, people spoke Fanti or Chi before then, but it hadn't been standardized as a language, and it hadn't been discussed in self-conscious terms of its intellectual significance before arguably the end of the 19th century and the very early decades of the 20th century. But it's ultimately about, in that era, how to make the vernacular do something grand. So Casely Hayford is a great point of illustration here because he really does see Fanti and, again, the kind of creation and standardization of vernacular language and literary and intellectual culture as the way to save the British Empire, for one, and that's another topic for another day, but also to reach this redemption, essentially, of civilization with a capital C.
Yeah.
And then you have the big moment of decolonization, properly speaking, right? Kind of formal decolonization, which is what I, as you note in passing, skip in the book. I've written about it plenty elsewhere, as any African literature scholar has. But you have the Achebe and Soyinka and the rise of often the Nigerian kind of ethnographic novels. And then Ngugi comes in sort of on the tail end of that. And that is a period of reclamation, of reinvigoration, reassertion, right? And I think when it falls short, it ends up being because it's about reassertion and reclamation kind of for its own sake. And it's easy to lose sight of, okay, well then what does it do conceptually, analytically? I mean, it's clear oftentimes what it does politically, and that's good, right? I mean, people are doing things that in large part, I agree with, but it also can become a kind of ethno-nationalist dead end. And
Sure.
I will win enemies saying this, but I tend to think that that's where Ngugi sometimes ends up, right? I mean, it's just sort of championing and championing. Okay, but you can only do so much with championing as a literary scholar or an intellectual historian. And then what I'm interested in is contemporary writers who are kind of, or recent writers, who are working in a hyper-local vein, oftentimes moving between in and out of African languages. Tenda Huchu is a great example. Kind of, we'll just throw a passage of Shona in. But it's not for its own sake. It's just because it's a pretty organic part of how they think. Jennifer Nansabuga Mukumbi, another great example. It's Chintu, this book I write about, is an incredibly local Ugandan novel. But it's also just because that's what it takes for her to figure out what, in my reading, is the distinction between reason and rationality, right? It's just necessarily a part of it.
Yeah.
And so I see this really important connection between the beginning of the 20th century and what happens, heading into now full steam the 21st century, where the vernacular is people. That's probably not the word I would use. The local is very much present, but it's present because it is necessary to have intellection, to represent intellection. And that's a little bit different than it being important because it achieves some clear political or even sort of political epistemological goal. And that's not to say that wasn't important, that it wasn't necessary. Absolutely not. But I'm personally trying to write about something a little less self-evident, right? A little bit denser, I guess, in terms of what locality does in these texts.
So let me follow that up with a question about another sort of big term question about the project, because that I'm really happy I asked you about that sort of local, global, and aspirations of literary practices, because that response for me is whatever that means for listeners who think about African literature and periodized differently aside. It raises some really interesting ideas about the sociological character of literature and other forms of thinking, other ways of thinking about cultural production. And so another, in some ways, a kind of trio that underlies exactly what you were talking about is this distinction, and I'll just say really quickly what I mean by each term, just to be clear, because they themselves are terms for debate. But this relationship between anti-colonial, decolonial, and post-colonial, right? Where anti-colonial is characterized primarily by negation or opposition, right? Decolonial, which is thinking about how to write, how to think, how to produce culture without the metropole. So thinking without colonial hegemony as a center, or even, I think, oftentimes in its most radical forms, not thinking with the center at all. And this notion of the post-colonial, which was, the trending term in the 90s, but I think has gotten sort of marginalized, I think really unfortunately, which is really this space of thinking about what it means to work outside the anxieties of colonialism, that one has to always work through those affects and effects. So those are, I think they're obviously deeply intertwined, but the anti-colonial, the decolonial, and the post-colonial are such powerful ways of talking about the Atlantic world in general. And I'm curious how those terms resonate in this particular project of yours.
Sure. And it's, oh man, it's such a fraught, the decolonial debates right now. I taught a graduate seminar called The Decolonial Intellectual, and it was an attempt to work with both decolonial thought, but also think about the material circumstances and really, institutional circumstances in histories of decolonial intellectuals. And one of the students said to me at one point, God, it seems like everyone has three different versions of what they think decolonial means, and they will go to the death for any one of them on any given day. And I do often feel like that. And watching some of these debates unfold over the past 2 years, I feel like the intellectual version of a social media lurker, where I'm just fascinated by seeing the exchanges, and I don't feel, perhaps oddly, a particularly strong commitment to kind of what I mean by decolonial. I would describe the African Novel of Ideas as a decolonial book that focuses on writers and intellectuals, because it's about philosophers as well, African philosophers, who have been in their own careers and their own lives either anti-colonial or simply kind of not colonial. But by which I mean, again, going to the sort of more recent writers who are, I suppose, in terms of periodicity, post-colonial, and that, yes, they still live very clearly in the afterlives of colonial institutional histories, funding paradigms, all these sorts of things. But my book is not a material history, right? I would very, very readily grant that we are in post-colonial times still. In the sense that field at its most salient intends it, without necessarily thinking that I wrote a post-colonial book. It's about decolonization as the modeling of what may be an unrealistically level playing field. Because again, we have the luxury as scholars, as intellectuals, as philosophers, even in terms of some of my subjects in the book, of doing that. Right? We have the luxury of writing in a way, of analyzing in a way, of sorting out in a way that is not necessarily reflective of, highly still unequal, and many times just straight up orientalizing, as a word I might use, material and institutional circumstances. And I don't think that in any way needs to be a disavowal of the very important politics of rectifying those institutional circumstances. I think it nonetheless says that we need to have a lot of intellectual irons in the fire to make that feel like something that's truly worth doing. So the model of decolonization that I am most attracted to is Kwesi Ureju's, and he talks about decolonization as the process of ensuring the possibility for Africans, and ideally for everyone, of due reflection. That's the phrase he uses. I was sort of meditating about it in one of my increasingly rare Facebook appearances the other day. And he says it's due reflection. It's not saying that you need to reinstantiate, you only abide by Akan principles, because I assure you a lot of people are going to be really fucked over by that. And it's not saying that you need to just, give up. We've been so thoroughly colonized that there's no way out of this total imbrication with colonial norms.
Yeah.
And so we need to just kind of do forward thinking, which would be some version of the kind of Africa Rising ethos or politics. He's saying we need to do whatever we can to line up the operative concepts and terms on either side of that, yes, naively or unrealistically differentiated equation, and then put them head to head, toe to toe, and figure out what we're prepared to defend on equal or kind of lateral grounds. And I think that that is an unbelievably noble and kind of rigorous goal. And that's what I try to do in the book, right? And to narrow it down further, what I try to do in the book is to say, well, can we have a sort of decolonial liberalism? Can we go through different places where African writers and African philosophers who are inarguably locally grounded and enmeshed, right? By which I mean that their point of departure is on the continent, first and foremost. And of course, it's inflected by other places and other processes. Sure. But they're starting from there in just a very literal way. I'm working with writers who are, for the most part, located there. And philosophers for at least the majority of their careers. And certainly, that's right, their books tend to be oriented. For them to say, I'm doing something that seems really liberal, but I'm doing it from here to these ends. So does that count, right? Does that get roped in with a sort of grand critique of liberalism from some of the books that I survey from contemporary postcolonial and or Black or ethnic studies? And I think the answer is very clearly no. And so you have liberalism and then you have liberalism. And in Ruedu fashion, we go through it and we map out well what it means here and what it means there, put them head to head, and figure out which one you're prepared to stand by and which one you're prepared to defend. And I don't know, decolonization to me has to be that. Or again, you run into this ethno-nationalist trap, sort of dead end, or a process that doesn't know quite where it's going. And I think there has to be some sort of end game in mind to make it meaningful.
Fascinating. No, that's really interesting. It's a lot to think about. And, it gets into this, and I hate to be trite about it, but in some ways, I think trite is really trite, simple statements of it are instructive. But essentially, what you're saying in that is, we have to take African writers seriously.
Yeah.
Right.
That's...
which is they may have maps that drill down into where they write from rather than outward to their colonial occupation. And I think that, I agree with you. I mean, the debates about what decolonial means, I think are totally interesting. But of course, it's academia during a pandemic, and that has to be a bloodbath.
Yeah, right.
I have to say, when I see that, as someone who went to graduate school in the early to mid 90s, the bloodbath of what was meant by deconstruction has no peer. But we may be approaching that in debates about the decolonial and the postcolonial.
I personally think so. And it's a shame because on a very basic level, what I wanted this book to do was to maybe just, if nothing else, show some literary or critical theory scholars that are interested in African textual production what African philosophers, and they may not have read, thought decolonization was. Yeah. And how we can still work with some of those definitions today. And unfortunately, a lot of there's a lot of deja vu for me right now, because I think, God, you just need to go back into the African philosophy debates of the 90s, and decolonization was debated, I think, by someone like Ruedu or Jeche or Ep4 or Eze, and there are many, many more. I mean, Sophie Olawole, a lot more rigorously. Again, kind of part of it's because of where it was located in terms of disciplinarity. Part of the fact that it was seen as a sort of disciplinary conversation, I think, and not this kind of free-floating or a kind of cathexis point for free-floating anxiety about the failure of discipline. So that's a big, big difference in the positionality of what the decolonial is. But I do think we're at an inflection point, and maybe the best thing I can do as a scholar, and that many of us can do who have worked on this stuff, for a long time, is to cite some actual examples of what other people, Bida and Jafo, kind of wrote wonderful stuff on this that I almost never see cited, what they
Sure.
thought decolonization was.
Yeah.
And that we don't need always to invent the wheel, right?
Hmm.
And I think that in that sense, just a revivification of
Sure.
old pieces, old articles. I've tried to just share a lot of things with my students, for example, that I don't think they're going to encounter elsewhere, can maybe be more useful than duking it out on Twitter or what have you.
Yeah, I think you're probably right on that. So I want to read this passage uh, from the conclusion, which I think is really fantastic um, passage. It really struck me. It's on page 187 for anyone who has the book and wants to read it in context. So I'm going to read it and just ask you to say a few words about it. What you had in mind, or why, what you think about this. I really liked it because it gets to this way in which the book takes African thought seriously as a way of, for you as an author, of thinking about the thought,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
And that premise of, these works don't need any redemption from the outside.
Yeah,
That's why I like the decolonial as a characterization. That's the way I read the book. It was very decolonial in that it doesn't refer to anything outside of itself, for justification. So I'm going to read this now, and then just ask you your thoughts.
sure.
You write, "This is not to indicate that Africa is somehow less philosophical than anywhere else. The African Novel of Ideas, the title of the book, I hope has led its readers to the opposite conclusion. On the contrary, I mean to position African writers at what is perhaps an alarming vanguard." I love that phrase, alarming vanguard. A philosophical selfhood with worldly and narrative force would now appear to be a globally fantastic premise.
Yeah, this is where I'm going to get a little more polemical. I think I I think that the networked condition, as reified, and I do mean that in the sort of old school sense of the term, via social media especially, but by connectivity in a much grander sense, right? People just kind of constantly immersed in short form, inattentive processes, and I count myself in this fully. I am not claiming in any way to kind of hover beyond
Okay.
these processes, but I do think that it makes serious, meaningful intellection really, really, really fucking hard, bordering on impossible. And every writer that I am in conversation with, and I mean very literally in conversation with, frequently we'll just talk about, hey, where do we stand, what are we thinking about. It's a part of my extended intellectual community that I count myself extremely lucky to have. Hi Tende. Um, has to shut off their devices and shut off their social media and go away sometimes into, hermeticism to be able to write, and just to be able to figure out what they want their interiority to do for them, and the process of thinking. And I realize that's not a novel point. It might even sound glib. It's very easy to push back on and say, oh, well, no, this sort of, kind of hyper-connected, virtualized world is also a source of real democratization. And I hear all that, I get it. But at the end of the day, the cognitive, intellectual, and of course, ultimately political effects are so profound that I think we're only just beginning to reckon with them. There's a great book by Richard Seymour that I like a lot called The Twittering Machine, and it's a sort of extended philosophical and historical essay that uses Twitter, but really as a way into thinking about what virtuality means for just habits of mind, and the possibility to even think in terms of something like having deliberate habits of mind. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence, and here I this is going to be untenable in the amount of time that we have, but I'll go there anyway. I don't think it's a coincidence. At the same time as we are all, and I really do mean almost all. I mean, you can go to Elmina, where my husband's family is from, and go to a fishing dock and see people on their phones. So it's just incredibly pervasive. This is when a lot of the most penetrating novels coming from the continent that I've read, and I keep up with African literature pretty well, are from small and sometimes fringe presses, and they tend to feature characters who are socially isolated, in some cases completely socially alienated by their insistence on intellection. So there are all the texts that I do write about in my book, but there are also so many others just for want of space and time I didn't include. So a couple of them I do mention in the conclusion that you just read from a book like Baho, a Burundian novel where the, quote, philosophical character is a pariah, just outright pariah, right? And that's kind of the precondition of his being able to be this deep thinker and to be able to systematize his own thoughts. A book like Jumoke Verasimo's A Small Silence, where there's a professor who was imprisoned in I think it was the Abacha years in Nigeria, gets out, and he hasn't been brought into this, new sort of hyper-aware, hyper-connected world. And so he has to sit in his house in darkness because he actually can't afford electricity. And that's how he's able to kind of systematize his own thoughts. And the list goes on and on and on. There are so many examples that I could give you. It's not a coincidence. I'm sorry, it's not. The conditions of being able to capture something like intellection are increasingly extreme and increasingly marginal to the main line of literary production and to the main line of just living, man. And so that is what I'm talking about in that phrase, in this kind of alarming vanguard, where I could write a sort of celebratory article and have about the incredible flourishing of thinking about thoughts in these small press novels. But at the end of the day, I'm not necessarily sure that this is a good thing, because I don't know what it means for the possibility of being able to read, or really just of being able to think and watch your thoughts unfurl in a way that someone else might be able to make some sense of, right? I mean, I read a lot of novels these days that are kind of these phenomenological blurs. I think the phrase I used earlier, and they're interesting. They're provocative, but they're very hard for me to get any real traction with.
That's fascinating. Conditions of writing in the 21st century are I think, as you articulated really well, their own sort of philosophical problem.
I mean, when I'll put my hot take would be that Kwesi Uredu could not exist on Twitter, period.
Yeah.
and Claude, as Afrikaners would say. And I don't know. I'm not sure where we go from there, frankly.
So let me ask you a final question. It had two parts initially when I was thinking about it. Where do you think the book leaves us as readers? But I think you've articulated that really clearly. But I'm curious for you, where does this book leave you? I mean, the difference but overlap between your first and second book is I think really interesting, and you spoke to that at the outset. And I'm curious what's next. You've sort of suggested, but I want to give you a little bit of space to sketch out where the books of this idea, or the ideas of this book, are taking you in terms of your next book of ideas.
No, I'm grateful for any chance. I'm in the sort of really early book researching and book writing phase of unyielding obsession. I'm sure you know what I mean. With the next project, which I'm tentatively calling J.E.K. Salih Hayford, Ecumenical Modern, Ecumenical Modern. I can almost guarantee you that the publisher is not going to let ecumenical stand in the title, the same way that intellection was not able to stand in the title.
Publish it with a Catholic university press. They'll go with it, but otherwise you might be in trouble. Yeah.
Dear Notre Dame.
Exactly.
Alistair McIntyre, interested? Yeah. But I have now, speaking of the aperture allegory that we used, or metaphor that we used earlier, kind of gone back in and narrowed it further than my first book was, even in terms of how close to the close to the ground the traditions involved were. And I'm writing about J.E. Casely Hayford, who was this, at the time, incredibly famous, incredibly influential Gold Coast Fanti statesman and writer. He wrote arguably the first African novel in English, although there are a lot of Fanti passages as well. There were some things that were serialized in the Gold Coast Press before that, but the first sort of novel really published as a novel and circulated as such in the title. I'm writing a literary biography of him that is really a biography, I hope, of a moment in a sort of Stefan Zweig sense almost of what was this Fanti Confederate era of the late 19th, kind of into early 20th century. How did it use habits of mind, to take that phrase, which were of central importance to him and his writing, thinking about how to train himself to think well. And for him, thinking well meant not just in a way that allowed him to be a highly productive writer, but also in a way that allowed him to sort out his thoughts enough to take really, really forceful political action. Political is too broad here, really kind of bureaucracy building action. He was a decolonizer in this very, very material kind of logistical sense, right? Kind of what's the relationship between the width of the streets that we're planning in the Gold Coast to how I sit and think in my study
Wow. Okay.
to be really bold about it. But what did this era mean for how intellectual history ended up bringing different kinds of the African humanities together into the more famous era of the mid-20th century? So Kweku Larbi-Korang has done some of this work in a really wonderful book called, I think, Imagining Modernity, Writing Ghana, Imagining Africa. We're all pandemic. I have a 3.5-year-old. I'm very sorry for reshuffling his title. But there's so much more to be done. So it'll be something of an intellectual history, something of a literary biography, and a kind of story of how habits of mind generated in this real period and kind of intellectual circle around the city of Cape Coast in the present-day Ghana, so on the Atlantic seaboard, generated a bureaucracy. It generated a state. So how did explicitly doing intellectual history and explicitly theorizing habits of mind, explicitly theorizing character, bring the conditions for independent Ghana into existence? That's the gist.
That sounds excellent. I know I speak for everybody who hears your pitch on that and saying I look forward to. I'm sure lots of us are looking forward to that. Again, one of these moments where you're picking up something of critical importance, but also something that's largely not circulating in terms of
not circulating, unfortunately, and yet circulating without people realizing that it is. So
exactly.
Every
Perfect.
single time I read something on, and there's great work on Kwame Nkrumah, but I just think Kwame Nkrumah was not born like Athena, fully formed from Zeus. And the micro history of the Gold Coast is just massively important. Also, from a disciplinary perspective, everything that we now know as kind of African studies, right? I think, to my mind, kind of begins here, and yet it's been relegated to a very specialist domain. People who work on it very, very deeply. But a lot of the best materials on him and on this era are out of print. They only circulate in Ghana, if that. So I think it's high time for a book that can, as we talked about, kind of reach multiple readerships that have more passing investments or interests in West Africa and tell them how important this period was.
Absolutely agree. So we'll wrap up. I did want to say I'm so glad you brought up multiple times Kwazi Wiredu, may rest in peace. I think it's important in this moment to mark that. And Jeanne-Marie, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing these thoughts, which are absolutely fascinating and fantastic. Great book, and great to hear you talk about it.
Thank you so much. Obviously, this has been a hell of a few years, and the opportunities to talk like this, to riff, to say things that, you might revise 10 minutes later, but that you're really glad to have had the chance to be live about. Those opportunities have been woefully few and far between. So I am just really, really grateful for having had the chance to do it.
Well, you're welcome. It's all for our benefit. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John.
The story of the novel as it approaches global modernity has often been told as the story of representational failure. From Adorno to Achebe, Raymond Williams to Voloshoyinka, long-form narrative is cast as the genre par excellence of civilizational elegy and disruption. It is, quoting Lukács's foundational The Theory of the Novel, the epic of an age in which the extensive totality of life is no longer directly given, yet which still thinks in terms of totality. The form imagined this way is a record of striving through loss, climaxing in the convergence of modernist and late and post-imperial accounts of cultural crisis. While African writing has been seen in the past as a next frontier or an antidote of sorts to Western philosophical ennui, the hyperconnectivity of the global or even post-global era, per Tejumola Alanian, demands more flexible models now. From this view, the recent flurry of international interest in a small cohort of global Afropolitan writers misses the real possibility of the moment. Instead of marking yet another turn in an inverted historical progression that moves from a shadowy Western center to more enlightening peripheries, we should now be trying to figure out how the African novel, too, meaningfully fails.